Argentina declared independence in 1816. But 45 years later, the land was still divided between rival governments and rival armies. Spain was no longer the only enemy. Argentines were fighting Argentines over one dangerous question. Who would control the new country? Because Argentina was not created by one revolution, one leader, or one declaration. It had to be imagined, liberated, broken apart, and assembled again. And to understand how that happened, we must go back to a time before Argentina even existed. Before Argentina had borders, a flag, or even a name, its land was already home to numerous indigenous peoples. The Guarani, Diaguita, Com, Mapuche, Tehuelche, and many other communities lived across its forests, mountains, plains, and southern regions. They had their own languages, societies, trade networks, and systems of leadership. This was not an empty continent waiting to be discovered. But during the 16th century, Spanish expeditions began conquering and colonizing the region. Settlements were established, indigenous communities were displaced or forced into colonial systems, and distant European rulers began reshaping the land. The future country would eventually receive its name from something those newcomers desperately wanted: silver. Argentina comes from the Latin word argentum, meaning silver. European explorers heard stories of precious metals somewhere beyond the Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver. The river system later became an important route connecting the Atlantic coast, with silver arriving from Potosí. The name Argentina was therefore appearing in European writing long before Argentina existed as a nation. For generations, Spain governed the region as part of its enormous American empire. Then, in 1776, the Spanish crown created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. Buenos Aires became its capital. But this territory was far larger than modern Argentina. It included much of what would later become Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, along with other neighboring areas. Many locally born people of European ancestry were known as criollos. Some criollos became wealthy merchants, landowners, lawyers, and military officers. But many of the colony's highest positions were still dominated by officials born in Spain. Wealth was growing in Buenos Aires. So was resentment. Then, a foreign army arrived and exposed how vulnerable Spanish power had become. In 1806, British troops invaded and captured Buenos Aires. The Spanish colonial government failed to defend its own capital effectively. Local fighters organized, counterattacked, and recovered the city. Britain returned in 1807 with a much larger force. This time, fighting spread through the streets. Barricades blocked the roads. Soldiers fired from buildings. Civilians joined the resistance. The British were defeated again. The victories produced a revolutionary realization. The people of Buenos Aires had armed and defended themselves. They had discovered that their survival did not depend entirely on Spain. And once that lesson had been learned, another question became impossible to silence. Why should they continue obeying a distant empire? In 1808, the crisis suddenly became much bigger. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain. King Ferdinand VII was forced from the Spanish throne, and Napoleon placed his own brother in power. Across the Spanish Empire, nobody could agree on who now possessed legitimate authority. If the rightful king was gone, did his colonial officials still have the right to rule? News of Spain's collapsing government reached Buenos Aires. In May 1810, the political crisis erupted. Military commanders, colonial officials, and local leaders confronted one another while crowds gathered outside the Cabildo. On May 25th, Viceroy Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros was removed. A local government called the First Junta took power. Spanish authority in Buenos Aires had fallen, but Argentina had not yet been created. The revolutionaries controlled the capital. Now they had to persuade, or compel, the rest of the former viceroyalty to follow them. Revolutionary armies marched away from Buenos Aires. Some provinces accepted the new government. Others rejected it. Royalist forces remained powerful, particularly in Upper Peru, where Spain could launch repeated attacks against the revolution. Meanwhile, the enormous viceroyalty began fragmenting. Paraguay followed its own path and declared independence. The Banda Oriental eventually became Uruguay. Upper Peru later emerged as Bolivia. The territory governed from Buenos Aires was shrinking before the revolutionaries had even built a stable replacement. The old order was collapsing, but nobody yet agreed on what the new order should be. By 1816, the revolution was in danger. Napoleon had been defeated, Ferdinand VII had returned to power, and Spain was attempting to recover its American territories. The revolutionaries could no longer pretend that they were temporarily governing in the king's absence. They had to choose: complete separation or submission. Provincial delegates gathered in San Miguel de Tucumán, far from the vulnerable port of Buenos Aires. On July 9, 1816, they formally declared independence from the Spanish monarchy and rejected all foreign domination. The political connection with Spain had been severed. But declaring independence did not destroy the royalist armies. Freedom had been announced. Now it had to survive. One commander understood that defending the revolution inside its own territory would never be enough. His name was José de San Martín. The main royalist stronghold remained in Peru. As long as Spanish power survived there, the Southern Revolution could be attacked again. San Martín developed a plan that seemed almost impossible. Instead of advancing directly north, he would move west, across the Andes. In January 1817, thousands of soldiers began climbing through freezing mountain passes. They carried weapons, food, horses, and artillery through thin air and deadly cold. Some routes were used to distract the royalists. Others carried the main fighting force toward Chile. San Martín's army defeated the royalists at Chacabuco. Further victories helped secure Chile and opened the route to Peru. The campaign was not simply an act of expansion. San Martín believed independence could not survive while Spain retained its strongest South American base. The revolution was winning beyond Argentina's borders. Inside those borders, however, another war was beginning. Spain had been the common enemy. Once that enemy weakened, the provinces turned against one another. The central dispute concerned the structure of the new state. Unitarians wanted political power concentrated in a strong central government. Federalists defended the autonomy of the provinces. Buenos Aires stood at the center of the conflict. Its port handled much of the region's overseas trade. Customs revenue gave Buenos Aires enormous economic influence. Provincial leaders feared that independence from Spain would simply replace one distant ruler with domination from Buenos Aires. Alliances changed, governments collapsed, provincial armies invaded one another. In 1820, the central government disintegrated after the Battle of Cepeda. Argentina existed as a shared cause and a geographic idea, but it still struggled to function as one country. Even its name revealed the confusion. At different moments, leaders used titles including the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, the Argentine Confederation, and the Argentine Republic. They were fighting over how to govern a country that had not yet agreed on what to call itself. Those historical names remain recognized in Argentina's constitution even today. Argentina was not emerging through a clean and orderly process. It was being constructed from competing provinces, identities, and visions of power. During this disorder, one man became more powerful than any other provincial leader. Juan Manuel de Rosas governed Buenos Aires for most of the period between 1829 and 1852. He called himself a federalist and defended the formal sovereignty of the provinces, but Buenos Aires controlled customs income and managed the Confederation's foreign relations. That placed enormous influence in Rosas's hands. Under his rule, opponents faced censorship, exile, persecution, and violence. Rosas provided a form of unity, but Argentina still lacked a national constitution accepted by all the provinces. Eventually, one of Rosas's own federalist allies turned against him. His name was Justo José de Urquiza. Urquiza demanded constitutional organization and challenged Rosas's control. In 1852, their forces met at the Battle of Caseros. Rosas was defeated and fled into exile. After decades of civil war, Argentina finally had an opportunity to organize itself. But Buenos Aires was not ready to surrender its power. In 1853, representatives from the provinces adopted a federal constitution. It created a national government with a president, a Congress, and a federal system. It provided the political foundation of modern Argentina. But the most powerful province was missing. Buenos Aires had separated from the Confederation and refused to accept the new arrangement. Argentina now had a constitution, but remained divided between two states. On one side stood the Argentine Confederation. On the other stood the state of Buenos Aires. Each had its own government, military forces, and political interests. In 1859, the Confederation defeated Buenos Aires at another Battle of Cepeda. Buenos Aires agreed to rejoin after constitutional amendments were negotiated, but the rivalry had not disappeared. The final confrontation was approaching. On September 17, 1861, the armies met at the Battle of Pavón. The fighting itself produced an uncertain military situation, but Urquiza withdrew, leaving the forces of Buenos Aires in control of the political outcome. The Confederation's national government collapsed. Buenos Aires emerged as the dominant force in the reunited state. In October 1862, Bartolomé Mitre became president of the Argentine nation. 52 years had passed since the May Revolution. 46 years had passed since the Declaration of Independence. Argentina finally possessed a constitutional national government operating across the reunited provinces. Even then, the country was not completely finished. Provincial rebellions continued after 1862. Political leaders still fought over the power of Buenos Aires and the authority of the national government. The state also expanded through violent military campaigns into indigenous territories, dispossessing and killing many of the people who had lived there long before Argentina existed. National institutions grew under the presidencies of Mitre, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, and Nicolás Avellaneda. In 1880, the city of Buenos Aires was federalized and became the permanent national capital. By then, the central structure of the modern Argentine state had finally taken shape. So when was Argentina truly born? Was it in 1810, when Buenos Aires removed the Spanish viceroy? Was it in 1816, when independence was declared at Tucumán? Was it in 1853, when the federal constitution was adopted? Or was it in 1862, when the divided provinces finally came under one national presidency? The truth is that Argentina had more than one birth. It began as a revolution against an empire. It survived a war for independence, and it became a nation through decades of conflict over who would control it. Even that achievement carried a darker cost. The state was created not only through speeches, constitutions, and heroic battles, but also through civil war, political repression, and the violent seizure of indigenous lands. Its name began with a European dream of silver, but the country itself was forged from indigenous histories, colonial cities, revolutionary armies, provincial rivalries, and generations of people trying to turn a divided territory into one nation. Argentina was not born in a single moment. It was built through nearly a century of struggle, and that is how Argentina was born.